He called my ideas useless and delusional, but he couldn't see the quiet, burning ember of a plan that had just ignited within me. I remember the silence in the boardroom that day with a chilling clarity that still echoes in my mind. It wasn't the respectful quiet of focused minds engaged in intense deliberation, but the stunned hush of individuals too profoundly uncomfortable to meet my gaze, their eyes darting away as if fearing contagion. Across the polished mahogany, a surface that had reflected many a broken dream, Sterling Thorne, my former boss, leaned back in his meticulously chosen executive chair, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. It was the kind of grin that belonged on a predator after a successful hunt, utterly devoid of empathy. He had just finished presenting my brainchild, a groundbreaking digital campaign concept that had consumed months of my life, a concept born from countless sleepless nights and an almost obsessive dedication, as if it were entirely his own. Every slide, every data point, every projected KPI that had taken me tireless effort to compile was now attributed to his singular genius. He caught my eye, a glint of cruel, unadulterated triumph in his, and then, in a voice dripping with an almost theatrical condescension, he addressed the board. And as for Kalen's suggestions, he paused, letting his gaze sweep dismissively over me, his lips curling with an almost audible sneer, while well-intentioned, they were, frankly, useless. Delusional, even. His ideas lacked the strategic foresight required for a company of our stature. That's why I took the liberty of refining the approach entirely, building it into the robust, market-leading strategy you see before you. A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs, like static electricity, went through the room. I could feel the palpable weight of their judgment, the pity mixed with a very human, palpable relief that it wasn't them enduring this public execution. Each uncomfortable fidget, each averted glance, spoke volumes. But as Sterling Thorne, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, basked in his stolen glory, declaring his victory with every pompous, self-congratulatory word, a curious, almost profound calm settled over me. He saw defeat in my eyes, I knew it. He saw the end of my career here, the crushing of a spirit. What he couldn't see, what his limited, self-serving mind would never comprehend, was the quiet, burning ember of a plan that had been smoldering within me for months, now ignited into a roaring, unstoppable fire. He, in his arrogant blindness, had just handed me the match. And as the words, useless and delusional, echoed in the opulent, wood-paneled room, vibrating with their injustice, I simply smiled internally. He had no idea the game he had just started, or that he had already lost. To truly understand that moment, to grasp the depth of that internal smile, you need to go back, to the initial spark of ambition that had brought me to this company, to this very boardroom, years prior. I was in my early 30s, a marketing strategist with a mind that, if I may say so myself, saw patterns and possibilities where others saw only noise, only chaos. My passion wasn't for grandiosity or public accolades, but for the intricate puzzle of innovation, a deep-seated belief in the transformative power of strategic thinking. I'd poured my heart and soul into every project, often working late into the night, the fluorescent hum and the faint smell of cheap coffee my constant companions, fueled by the sheer thrill of a breakthrough, the satisfaction of a complex problem unraveled. My initial years were marked by steady progression, quiet successes that often went unnoticed by the upper echelons who preferred flash over substance, but which built a solid, unspoken foundation of respect among my peers, the true engine room of the company. Then Sterling Thorne entered the picture as my direct superior, arriving with a flourish and a pronouncement of his supposed brilliance. From the outset, our dynamic was challenging, to put it mildly. Sterling was everything I wasn't, loud, overtly confident to the point of boisterousness, and utterly obsessed with superficial appearances. He thrived on praise and public adoration, a glutton for applause, but beneath that polished veneer, I quickly sensed a profound, gnawing insecurity. He was a master of delegation, not to empower his team, but to meticulously offload responsibility, creating a buffer between himself and any potential failure. He was a virtuoso at taking credit, a silent thief of intellectual labor. Initially, it was small things, a minor tweak to a report I'd drafted that suddenly became his insight, a clever turn of phrase in a presentation he'd simply read aloud, a strategic idea that morphed into one of his brainstorms once it gained traction. I brushed it off, perhaps too focused on the work itself, too consumed by the process of creation. I harbored a naive, almost foolish belief that good work would speak for itself, that undeniable results would eventually cut through the noise, that integrity would ultimately prevail. How utterly wrong I was. But Sterling's pattern escalated, growing bolder, more audacious. He would hover during my brainstorming sessions, ostensibly offering guidance, his eyes gleaming with a predatory glint, but truly just silently absorbing information, extracting value. He'd request detailed outlines and meticulous data analyses, then lose them only for perfectly replicated versions, subtly rephrased and reattributed, to emerge later under his name. The subtle psychological warfare began to wear on me. I began to realize that my quiet determination, which I considered a strength, a sign of focused professionalism, was perceived by Sterling as a critical weakness, an open invitation for exploitation. He saw my meticulousness not as a professional standard, but as a convenient source for his own shortcuts, a wellspring of free labor and unearned glory. The insidious nature of his actions, the constant, subtle erosion of trust, began to chip away at my naive idealism. My blood would run cold each time I saw my own words, my own concepts, presented as his own, a mockery of originality. The breaking point arrived with a crisis that threatened to engulf the entire company. We faced our most critical challenge yet, a plummeting public image, a hemorrhaging of consumer trust, and a significant, alarming loss of market share. This, I thought, was my moment, my opportunity to prove the true value of my strategic vision. I envisioned a radical, digitally focused campaign that would not only overhaul our tarnished brand perception but also fundamentally redefine our engagement strategy, reconnecting us with a disillusioned customer base. It was a concept born of countless late nights, deep dives into emerging technologies, and a comprehensive, almost forensic analysis of consumer psychology. I didn't just have an idea, I had a meticulously crafted blueprint, a living document, complete with a phased rollout plan, detailed risk assessments, and robust projected ROI calculations. And crucially, I had compiled every scrap of research, every initial sketch, every internal email documenting the developmental process, every version control timestamp. This was my secret weapon, not some clandestine ally or an outside informant, but the undeniable, irrefutable truth itself, meticulously documented in a way that left absolutely no room for doubt or misinterpretation. I had learned Sterling's game, his predatory methods, and I had prepared for it, quietly and systematically, building a digital fortress of evidence around my intellectual property. The irony was, I hadn't prepared it for a grand, dramatic reveal, not initially. I had compiled it for my own protection, a last resort in case things truly went south, a shield against potential injustice. I just didn't realize then how spectacularly south they would go, or how perfectly my preparations would align with the coming storm. Within the project plan, subtly embedded, were critical nuances and interdependencies, complexities that only a truly innovative, deeply understanding mind could navigate successfully. I had, in fact, deliberately left these subtle complexities, these strategic challenges, knowing that a superficial approach would inevitably stumble. Sterling, true to form, would blunder. After the board meeting, despite the raw, burning sting of betrayal, the humiliation of public discrediting, I didn't lash out. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply collected my belongings from my now empty office, a strange, almost profound tranquility settling over me, like the calm eye of a storm. Sterling, bloated with false triumph, emboldened by my apparent lack of fight, probably saw this as confirmation of my insignificance, my utter brokenness. He wanted a reaction, a public meltdown, a validation of his superior power and cunning. I gave him nothing. My dismissal, while undeniably humiliating in the moment, was also a profound liberation. It freed me from the suffocating confines of a toxic, soul-draining environment and ignited a singular, compelling purpose that burned with an almost sacred intensity. My quiet smile transformed into a vow. I didn't immediately plunge into a new corporate role, desperate to prove myself. Instead, I quietly and strategically leveraged my extensive network, securing a series of high-profile consulting gigs that allowed me to work independently, refining my skills, broadening my reach, and demonstrating my capabilities without the shadow of corporate politics. I didn't speak ill of my former company or of Sterling Thorne. My silence was deliberate, a strategic withdrawal, a cloak of invisibility. While I meticulously documented my new successes, building an impressive, undeniable portfolio of results, I also kept a keen, calculating eye on my old firm. I knew my stolen campaign, while brilliant in its original form, had critical nuances and dependencies, subtle interlocking parts that Sterling, with his superficial understanding and lack of true strategic depth, would inevitably miss or mismanage. He lacked the foresight, the deep understanding of the underlying principles, to adapt it to the ever-shifting digital landscape. He launched the campaign, taking full credit for its initial, fleeting buzz, but the results were mediocre at best, a pale imitation of the original vision. The digital landscape shifted rapidly, as it always does, and without the profound strategic insight that had birthed the original concept, Sterling was utterly unable to adapt, to pivot, to innovate. The initial positive buzz, the manufactured excitement, quickly faded, replaced by stagnation. The company's public image began to stutter, failing to truly recover, caught in a downward spiral. My former colleagues, many of whom harbored a deep-seated resentment towards Sterling for his arrogance and incompetence, occasionally reached out, sharing anecdotes of his increasingly erratic behavior, his desperate attempts to regain control, and the company's slow, agonizing decline. They spoke of missed targets, of failed initiatives that bled resources, of a growing internal disquiet that festered into despair. I listened, I observed, and I continued to build my own empire, brick by silent brick, each success a testament to the very value Sterling had so arrogantly dismissed. My reputation grew exponentially, not through self-promotion or slick marketing, but through tangible, undeniable results that spoke louder than any words. The whispers in the industry were that if you wanted real innovation, real results, a true turnaround, Kalin was the one to call. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, nearly 2 years to the day after my unceremonious exit. It was from Eleanor Vance, the chairwoman of the board, a woman of formidable intellect, sharp as a tack, and unwavering integrity, who had seemed visibly uncomfortable during Sterling's grand theft, her eyes betraying a hint of unease. She explained, with a tone of carefully veiled desperation that suggested a ship rapidly taking on water, that the company was now truly on the brink. Sterling's leadership, or rather, his utter lack thereof, had driven it into a deeper hole than ever before, a chasm of debt and despair. They needed a radical change, a new vision, someone capable of a complete, almost miraculous turnaround. She asked if I would consider applying for a senior executive position, perhaps even the chief marketing officer role, the very one I had been denied. I listened calmly, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum, a silent crescendo of anticipation. This was it. The moment I had silently anticipated, carefully orchestrated, had finally arrived. Eleanor, I replied, my voice measured and calm, devoid of any hint of triumph or bitterness, I appreciate the offer, deeply. But my consulting work has opened my eyes to a broader scope, a different kind of impact. I believe I can help your company, but not in the capacity of CMO. My words hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken meaning. A week later, I stood at the head of the very same boardroom table where Sterling had so gleefully dissected, then discarded, my career. The atmosphere was charged with a different kind of tension now, one of desperate hope, mixed with a palpable anxiety. All eyes were on me. Sterling, looking visibly aged, his face sallow and haggard, his usual bluster replaced by a nervous tremor, sat opposite me. His eyes were narrowed in suspicion, his jaw clenched. He hadn't been informed of my return, only that an external consultant of considerable reputation was presenting a new strategic vision that day. He saw me, and a flicker of recognition, then disbelief, then a dawning, sickening horror crossed his face, stripping away all pretense of composure. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but Eleanor Vance, with a rare, stern, almost chilling look, silenced him with a single, imperious glance. "Kalin," she began, her voice radiating quiet, unshakable authority that left no room for dissent. "Please proceed with your presentation." I began to speak, my voice steady, confident, filled with a gravitas born of 2 years of relentless growth, of quiet conquest. I didn't start with an attack, not yet. I started with the numbers, the cold, hard, inescapable reality of the company's precipitous decline under current management. The grim statistics, projected onto the massive screen, spoke for themselves. Then, with a practiced ease, I unveiled my new strategic vision. It wasn't just an updated version of my original campaign, it was a comprehensive overhaul, incorporating the invaluable lessons learned from my independent ventures and the latest, most profound market shifts. It was daring, innovative, audacious, and meticulously planned, every detail accounted for. And as I spoke, as I laid out the path to redemption, I began to weave in the subtle threads of my secret weapon, like a master weaver introducing a complex pattern. "This new direction," I explained, my voice gaining a quiet intensity, as I clicked a slide on the massive screen displaying my intricate plan, "is built upon foundational research conducted some years ago. Research that, regrettably, was mismanaged and misrepresented the first time around, leading to the unfortunate trajectory we now find ourselves on." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over Sterling, who was now shifting uncomfortably, his face paling, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "For instance, this core algorithm for predictive advertising," I highlighted a complex sequence on the screen, "a masterpiece of digital engineering, was initially developed with a critical failsafe, a feedback loop designed to prevent market saturation, to ensure long-term, sustainable growth. A feature that, upon its initial implementation, was unfortunately disregarded, overridden, in favor of a simpler, less robust approach. I have email threads, timestamped drafts, and even internal version control logs from that period testifying to its original inclusion and subsequent removal. I believe, Sterling, you were quite insistent on its simplification back then, calling it unnecessary complexity that would slow down rollout." Sterling Thorne spluttered, his face a mottled red and white, his composure crumbling. "That's absurd. I implemented the plan as presented to me. This is defamation." I simply smiled, a calm, knowing smile that chilled him to the bone, a smile that conveyed absolute, unassailable truth. "Perhaps. But my records, securely archived on an encrypted server and independently verified by a third-party cybersecurity firm, suggest otherwise. The original pitch, the one presented to this very board, outlining these specific solutions, these fail-safes, was completed and submitted under my direct authorship on specific date 2 years ago. Every line of code, every strategic pivot, every projected outcome, was meticulously documented by me." I clicked again, and the screen displayed a devastating side-by-side comparison, Sterling's original, failed presentation next to my digitally watermarked, date-stamped document, its authenticity undeniable. The similarities were undeniable, a clear act of plagiarism, but the subtle, critical differences, the missing fail-safes, the strategic errors born of a lack of true understanding, were glaring, illuminated by the stark contrast. The intellectual property of this concept, and indeed much of the subsequent strategic framework that was attempted, was mine. It was stolen. The room erupted. Whispers, gasps, and the furious, inarticulate protests of Sterling Thorne, who finally found his voice, albeit a desperate, high-pitched one. He called me a liar, a fraud, a fantasist, his accusations tumbling out in a frantic torrent. But I simply held up a secure, encrypted drive, its small, unassuming presence a stark contrast to his bluster. "Every single piece of evidence is here, cross-referenced and unassailable. Proof of conception, development, and my repeated attempts to protect this intellectual property. I pursued this not out of malice, Sterling, but out of a profound belief in the success of this company, a belief I hold to this day. A belief you nearly destroyed." Eleanor Vance rose, her face grim, her eyes burning with a cold fury. "Sterling," she commanded, her voice cutting through the din like a sharpened blade, "that is quite enough. Kalen, thank you for your comprehensive presentation. We will deliberate." The deliberation, I later learned, lasted less than 15 minutes. Eleanor, a woman who valued integrity above all else, who had likely harbored her own suspicions for years, saw the clear, unassailable facts. My meticulously compiled evidence, combined with Sterling's undeniable history of underperformance and his now public meltdown, was the final nail in his coffin, hammered home with quiet precision. Sterling Thorne was dismissed that very afternoon, not quietly, not with a dignified, pre-arranged departure, but with a public announcement citing gross professional misconduct and failure to uphold company values. The shock waves rippled through the organization, followed by a collective, palpable sigh of relief from many. Colleagues who had once averted their gaze, out of fear or pity, now approached me, offering sincere apologies, thinly veiled congratulations, and genuine expressions of support, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and liberation. I accepted them all with a quiet nod, no gloating, no grand pronouncements. My victory wasn't in his downfall, not truly. It was in my hard-earned, undeniable ascendance. Because a week later, Eleanor called another board meeting, this one much smaller, more intimate. She offered me the role of Chief Executive Officer. Not CMO, not consultant, but CEO. My ultimate plan, the one I had nurtured in silence, the one that had smoldered and then roared, had come to fruition with a precision I could only have dreamed of. I accepted without hesitation. Months have passed since that watershed day. The company, under my strategic guidance, is slowly but surely reclaiming its former glory, rising from the ashes like a phoenix. The air inside these walls is different now, less fear, more collaboration, more genuine innovation, more trust. Sterling Thorne is a ghost, a forgotten shadow in the company's narrative, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones to new employees. I often think about that moment in the boardroom, his triumphant smirk, his declaration that I was useless and delusional. Those words, rather than breaking me, rather than crushing my spirit, forged an unyielding resolve within me. They became the fuel for my ambition, the silent promise I made to myself, the constant reminder of what I was fighting for. My journey taught me a profound truth, etched into my very being. True power isn't about crushing your adversaries with force or malice, it's about building yourself up with such unwavering integrity, such undeniable capability, and such relentless strategic foresight that their attempts to diminish you become utterly, tragically irrelevant. It's about letting your work, your character, and your relentless pursuit of excellence speak for themselves, with a voice that cannot be silenced. Because when you do that, when you truly own your worth and your vision with quiet confidence, the universe has a funny, incredibly satisfying way of ensuring that, eventually, you get the last, most complete, and most satisfying word of all.